In this second part of my talks about cosmologies of capitalism, I want to look at a method for trying to understand why paradigms change in the social sciences. The idea that there are worldviews, paradigms, epistemes, whatever you like to call them, and that they shift over time, and that they affect all the social sciences and other disciplines, is of course not confined to Foucault and Kuhn, who I talked about last time. It's implicit and explicit in the work of a number of anthropologists, and I'll just give a couple of examples. One is from Edmund Leach, who worked in the middle of the 20th century mainly, and he wrote, for instance, in academic work, the evaluation of concepts depends as much upon fashion as upon utility. In the decade following World War II, the concept of social structure became extremely fashionable among social anthropologists, and at times attained such extreme generality that it could be applied to almost any ordered arrangement of social phenomena. In a sense, these lectures are looking at fashions or myths or sets of beliefs about how the world works and how we understand it, which have lain behind all the different social sciences over the last 400 years. But Leach, having mentioned this fact, doesn't then go into the question of why people should be so attracted to social structure or structuralism, which will be the paradigm I look at towards the end of this series. Someone who does go a bit deeper is the great American anthropologist of the first half of the 20th century, A.L. Kroeber. And he does this by looking at concepts of time in Western and other cultures. He says, popularly, evolution is almost synonymous with progress, and progress means advance to something better. Actually, the idea of progress is itself a culture phenomenon of some interest. Strange as it may seem to us, most of humanity, during most of its history, was not imbued at all with the idea. An essentially static world, a nearly static mankind, were most likely to be taken for granted. If there was any notion of alteration, a deterioration from the golden age of the beginnings, as frequently believed in, was as frequently believed in as an advance. He gives a lightning shift just in a paragraph, which is very illuminating, about shifts in paradigms of the kind that I'll be talking about. He says, a definite system of belief in progress began to acquire strength only in 18th century Europe. Reinforced by the French Revolution, so he's linking it to some major political change, it became a sort of article of liberal faith in the 19th century. It entered into the philosophy of Kant and Spencer. The latter saw evolution as a manifestation of progress. Darwin, who propounded a mechanism by which organic change might be explained, theory of evolution, a mechanism about which the man in the street is probably still fairly hazy, was popularly acclaimed as having proved evolution, that is, progress. There is a certain nobility about this sentiment of liberalism, but it is indubitably a sentiment and a dogma, and not a scientific conclusion. In other words, if we look cross-comparatively, the idea of progressive evolution, which will be the central paradigm of my talks, is one of the great assumptions now of Western civilization, but, and it lies behind much of our philosophy, our social thinking, and even our science, but it's a belief, nothing more than that. Kroeber continues that the concept of the progress of humanity is a special characteristic of contemporary Western civilizations. That within this civilization it generally has the force of an a priori assumption, that is, something you base your other assumptions on. Like most a prioris, it is adhered to with considerable fervour of emotion. You don't question your fundamental beliefs. Now, this idea means that we can look at ideas of progress, change, and the deeper philosophies of the social sciences cross-comparatively. It's a categorical imperative, as Kant would describe it. And in fact, Kant's views are described by Norman Brown as saying that time was not a thing in itself, out there, but a scheme of the human mind. Norman Brown, in fact, takes this one stage further and argues that economists and scientists must face up to the fact that in dealing with time at all, they are dealing with a religion, as with Worf, the linguist, who found that the Hopi sense of time was rooted in religious valuations. This is, I'm quoting. The classical Western sense of time and Newtonian time, which is at its heart, was a religion, which, like all religions, was taken by its adherents to be an absolute, objective truth. Now, I can read out Norman Brown and Kant and others, but since this is so essential to grasp the relativity of our views, which is at the heart of anthropology and what I'm trying to explain, and since it's really essential to see that our whole philosophical social science systems are belief systems which we should interrogate, that they have changed, that they're quite recent, that they are quite culture specific to parts of the world. In order to probe into that, I need to take something that might be seen of as a digression into concepts of time and space. Because what I'm trying to show is, in a way, rather like Einstein, that time and space are interrelated, as he showed, but also that time and space are more widely related to economic, political, social, and other factors outside them. That how we conceive of time and space, which includes how we think of histories changing through time, or archaeologists' work, or even economists, psychologists' work, is the result of much wider forces in society of a deep kind, which we don't often think of as directly affecting our thought systems. So I want to now look at a few thoughts of anthropologists who, because they went to other societies with very different time systems and spatial categories, began to see in these simpler cases how our cosmological systems were not exactly a product of, but deeply related to political relations, social relations, economic relations. Because what I want to do, in a sense, is to look at the history of the social sciences as if I was looking at the cosmological systems of a tribal society, but apply it instead not to one tribal society, such as the one I worked in the Himalayas, for instance, but apply it to the whole of a civilization, what I call the capitalist world, i.e. Western societies, America, Europe, England, and so on, and see how our cosmologies have been deeply influenced by something outside the theoretical systems. So let me now turn to the contrast between tribal and Western ideas of time and the idea of the invention of time. I want to look firstly at one or two well-known accounts by British anthropologists. One is by Edmund Leach in some essays, interesting essays on time. He says He asks how we know that time exists, because it's a man-made notion, he says. The oddest thing about time is surely that we have such a concept at all. We experience time, but not with our senses. We don't see it, we don't touch it, we don't smell it, or taste it, or hear it. How then do we know that it exists at all? He says in 3 ways. Firstly, we recognize repetition. Secondly, we recognize aging, that things grow older. And thirdly, our third experience of time concerns the rate at which time passes. This is tricky, for time actually passes irregularly. Thus, now, the irregularity of our experience of time is rather nicely put by Einstein himself in a joke he made, where he said, when he was asked to explain relativity, he said, well, the relativity of time can be shown if you are kissing someone you really love, the kiss goes past in a flash. If you sit on a hot ember, a bit of coal, time seems to slow down and the agony endures for a long time. So our experiences dictate the speed at which time passes, leading to the ironic fact that when we're happy, time whizzes away. When we're unhappy, it goes very slowly. So time, just for human experience, seems irregular, and yet we have learnt to think of time as very regular. So time is a man-made notion, is what Leach is saying, and in Rethinking Anthropology, in an essay on the symbolic representation, he says, and yet clocks apart, it seems to me that our modern English notion of time embraces at least 2 different kinds of experience, which are logically distinct and even contradictory. First, there is the notion of repetition. Whenever we think about measuring time, we concern ourselves with some kind of metronome. Secondly, there is the notion of non-separation, repetition. Now our modern sophisticated view tends to throw an emphasis on the second, that time is like a river, time is like an arrow, it doesn't repeat itself, you can't go into the river again. Time, says the philosopher Whitehead, is sheer succession of epochal duration. It goes on and on, it doesn't go back. So we have repetitive time and we have non-repetitive time. Another person who helped us understand tribal concepts and our own sense of time was Leach's contemporary Meyer Fortes. He says, in our culture, time is a commodity that must not be wasted. You must save time, you must spend time, time is money, etc. This is impressed on us from childhood and continues to be impressed on us by all our social institutions. The autobiography of the poet John Betjeman, for example, puts it, is called Summoned by Bells. His prep school, which was the one I went to too, was teaching him how to be strictly ruled by time. So this idea of time, as Fortes goes on, fits in with our cosmology and with our ideas of history as linear development. It fits our family system, with its virtual lack of continuity for more than one generation at a stretch. Now that's very interesting ideas, because Fortes is now linking time to wider things, including the whole kinship system. But, he says, many primitive societies have a very different concept of time. They see it as a perpetual cycle of seasons, following one another in the same succession. Their social life seems to them to be the same for generation after generation, with grandsons replacing their grandfathers to carry on the traditional order. They express this in beliefs, in reincarnation and in myths. The myth, for example, that the rainbow is a celestial serpent who appears every year at the appropriate time. Time, he says, is an aspect of the occasion, the purpose, the need met, not something expendable in its own right. That's a very important idea which I'll come back to in Fortis's exact contemporary Edwardspritchard, who has this, elucidates that further. The third person I'd like to look at is Robin Horton, who was trained as a scientist and who compared scientific and social matters. And he says, he worked in West Africa. In traditional Africa, methods of time reckoning vary greatly from culture to culture. Within each culture, again, we find a plurality of time scales used in different contexts. They all serve to order events in before-after series. Further, they have the very general characteristic that vis-à-vis after and before is usually vis-à-vis after. Before is usually valued positively, sometimes neutrally, and never negatively. The old times were good. Now it's not so good. Degeneration. That's my wording. Whatever the particular scale involved, then the passage of time is seen as something deleterious or at best neutral. On the major time scale of the typical traditional culture, things are thought of as having been better in the golden age of the founding heroes than they are today. The corollary of this attitude to time is a rich development of activities designed to negate, to stop the passage by a return to the beginning. Such activities characteristically depend on the magical premise that a symbolic statement of some archetypal event can in a sense recreate that event and temporarily obliterate the passage of time which has elapsed since its original occurrence. He cites the famous author on this, Mircea Eliade, on myth of the eternal return. This idea of going back, circular time, reliving the golden ages, Horton points out from his scientific background, is very different from the idea of scientific time, which is an idea of movement. You don't go back, of progress, of going on. He says when we turn from the traditional thinkers to the scientists, we find that this whole valuation of temporal process turned upside down. Not for the scientist the idea of a golden age at the beginning of time, an age from which things have been steadily falling away. For him the past is a bad old past, and the things lie far behind. And the best lies ahead. The passage of time brings inexorable progress. As C.P. Snow has put it aptly, all scientists have the future in their bones. Where the traditional thinker is busily trying to annul the passage of time, the scientist may almost be said to be trying frantically to hurry up time. That, in a way, is the definition of an experimental method. Experimental methods, the laboratories, are trying to speed up time. They're trying to make things happen very, very quickly so that you can observe them occurring. Most of the things might occur 20 years apart in the ordinary world, but within the test tubes and the laboratories they are speeded up. Mircea Eliade, who I mentioned, has similar ideas. He has archaic time, which is cyclical, periodic and unhistoric. You don't have periods of the past. Modern time is progressive, historical, continuous, irreversible. This is Norman Brown on Eliade. Eliade shows that the periodicity of archaic time is based on a religion of periodic redemption, that you redeem past time. It sounds a bit like À la recherche de la temps perdu, Proust. Lost time, you try and redeem. And modern progressive time is based on a religion of ultimate redemption. The redemption, the good times, the coming of the Messiah is in the future, which is Hebrew, he says, in origin, and given classical formulation in Christianity. I'll be coming back to that. One one or two other anthropologists I'd like to consider, Frenchmen again, are Pierre Bourdieu, who quotes the people he worked with in North Africa, the Kabyles. He says, an old Kabyle once said, "The French act as if they would never die. Nothing is more foreign to the indigenous civilizations of Algeria than the attempt to secure a hold over the future, and nothing more strange to it than the idea of an immense and open future as a broad field of innumerable possibilities which man is able to explore and dominate." This is obviously Bourdieu having quoted this man. The future is open, we can dominate it, we can shape it, and all sorts of exciting things are going to happen in it. That is a strange idea to many people. He describes qualitative time in most societies. Time stretches out, given a rhythm by the round of the work and the holidays and by the succession of nights and days. Time so marked is not, as has often been shown, measured time, tick, tick, tick. The intervals of subjective experience are not equal and uniform. Some periods feel long, some periods feel short. The effective point of reference in the continual flux of time's passage are qualitative nuances read upon the surface of things. This is Bourdieu. Time is discontinuous. It's not a continuous process. Time experience, just like space experience, is discontinuous, made up of a series of different islets or heterogeneous islets of differing duration. Nothing holds time together in one linear sense. All changes or nothing changes. Thus everything is in lumps. Everything holds together, I'm quoting Bourdieu. We can understand therefore that the passage from the traditional attitude to the predictive one, the present one, cannot be effected in bits and pieces. What tends to happen when Western time concepts come into societies is sweep away a good deal of this qualitative attitude. And finally, another great thinker on time, another Frenchman, Lévi-Strauss, who says, makes a big distinction between tribal time and Western time. He suggests that historical explanatory systems are very different from what he calls totemic or classificatory systems of explanation. I quote, "This perhaps explains what one is tempted to call the totemic void, that is, the absence of totemism in Western cultures. For in the bounds of the great civilizations of Europe and Asia, there is a remarkable absence of anything that might have reference to totemism. The reason is surely, he says, that the latter, the Eurasian civilizations, have elected to explain themselves by history, and that this undertaking is incompatible with that of classifying things and beings." In some ways there's some overlap with what I talked about with Foucault before. Classifying and resemblances is different from history, but Lévi-Strauss goes much deeper and sees it as a characteristic of Eurasian civilizations back to the monotheistic religions of the Hebrews and so on. So Lévi-Strauss distinguishes between peoples without history, which became the title of a book by Eric Wolf, The Peoples Without History, and others, those who do have history. And he describes, uses just words to describe these as cold peoples without history. The history in a sense is frozen, and hot societies which are constantly thinking of themselves as changing. The former, that is cold societies, seek by the institutions they give themselves to annul the possible effects of historical factors, coming back to Eliade and others, that they try and stop time. They try and give the idea that nothing is changing, that the good old days are always here. The latter, hot societies, historical societies, have internalized, he says, the historical process. All these quotations I've given point to startling contrasts. They show that history and time classification systems fit with contrasting societies, but they don't really show yet, although there are allusions in Fortes to family systems and so on, why there's such a big difference. And again, there are allusions to Christianity and religion, which seem important. What we can do, though, is to learn from this certain things. We can distinguish three major categories of time system, as does Leach: lineal, circular, and oscillatory. We ourselves, he says, in thinking about time, are far too closely tied to the formulation of the astronomers. If we do not refer to time as if it were a coordinate straight line stretching from an infinite past to an infinite future, we describe it as a circle or cycle, and this is cyclical time. Indeed, in some primitive societies, it would seem that the time process is not experienced as a succession of epochal durations at all. There is no sense of going on and on in the same direction, or even round and round the same wheel. It's something, it is discontinuous, it changes, but it tends to go backwards and forwards. It's a repetition of repeated reversals, a sequence of oscillations between polar opposites, and this is what he developed in his famous book on political systems of Highland Burma. Between night and day, between winter and summer, between drought and flood, age and youth, life and death. There's no depth to this system, he says. Past is equally past, but we're now in a different phase and we go back again. Another elaboration, a slight advance, I think, is through the work of Robin Horton on the idea of open societies and open time, and progress, which is the basis of science. Progress, the open predicament and the sense of time. He says the person who enjoys the moving world of the sciences then enjoys the exhilaration of the skater. But for many, this is a nervous, insecure sensation, skating on thin ice, which they would like to exchange for the womb-like warmth of the traditional theories and their defences. This lingering sense of insecurity gives a powerful attraction to the idea of progress. We may feel insecure, but at least things will get better. For by enabling people to cling to some hoped-for future state of perfect knowledge, it helps them live with a realization of the imperfections and transience of present theories. Once formed, he says, indeed, the idea of progress becomes in itself one of the most powerful supports of the scientific attitudes generally. For the faith that, come what may, new experiences must lead to better theories, and that better theories must eventually give place to even better theories, provides the strongest possible incentive for a constant readiness to expose oneself to the strange and the disturbing, to scrap current frameworks of ideas and to cast about for replacements. Otherwise there'd be no point if you didn't think there was going to be better. And what we become aware of is that time is something relative to a social system, a social structure, and that it's manipulated by societies. I'll be elaborating this much more fully in a minute, but it was recognized by another distinguished anthropologist, Bohannon, Laura Bohannon, in in her article on TIV genealogies, Mrs. Bohannon says that the way in which TIV, as an African society, learned genealogies and the lack of written records allow changes to occur through time without a general realization of the occurrence of that change. Social change can exist with a doctrine of social permanence. Now, we may think this is just for societies without writing, but I've seen the same thing happening even in a highly literate society like Cambridge, where I teach. We live mainly in an oral culture in Cambridge. That is, that the minutes and a lot is not written down. So people say, oh, well, we used to do it like this. And we never did used to do it like this. We've half remembered. And so you're constantly changing, reinventing, elaborating, imagining that not much is being changed while it is being changed, because you don't keep referring. This was one of the great beauties, again, of the English legal system, because it was an unwritten system on the whole. It had precedents and a lot was written down, but it was mainly an oral system. So this allows you to change things all the time, but feel that you are still maintaining the old traditions. So, as well as the absence of writing, which may be writing things down, which may help you to have a sense that continuity is there, another reason for a sense of being subject to time, which Bourdieu also goes into, is the technological system. If you are in a very insecure technological environment, you can see how your world is shaped by the forces of nature around you. He says that the submission to nature is inseparable from the submission to the passage of time, scanned in the rhythm of nature. The profound feelings of dependence and solidarity towards that nature, whose vagaries and rigours he suffers, together with the rhythms and constraints to which he feels the more subject, since his techniques are particularly precarious, foster in the Kabyle peasant an attitude of submission and of nonchalant indifference to the passage of time, which no one dreams of mastering, using up, or saving. Now this is another interesting hint. The idea that once you can control your environment through technology, advanced technologies, gives you a sense of mastery over your world, and hence a sense that you can make your history, that history has changed in the past and that you can make it change in the future. And of course this is one of the great themes behind interpretations of the work of Francis Bacon, who put forward a manifesto for science in his Advancement of Learning, which said we can, through science, shape our world, when we must try and do so to make it better, and we have the means. And the past is the past. They didn't have compasses and gunpowder and clocks and things like that in the Greek times. Things have changed since then, and we can change them into the future. So that's another factor which I'll come back to. Another is the relationship, which one might not have thought of, between time and money. Bourdieu again says, thus the use of money, in contrast to trade in kind, presupposes adopting the perspective of the possible, a projective attitude, admitting an infinite number of possibilities, which may equally be realized or not. The use of money supposes the vision of an abstract future, imagined and absent, while barter-like hoarding sees a concrete forthcoming within reach, in pre-perceptive anticipation and in the mode of belief. It's not easy to understand that as much of Bourdieu, but it has hints of something interesting. But by far the most important lesson in the whole of this interlude of anthropology is related in a way to some of Durkheim's ideas, and that is that the notions of time and history are not absolute in themselves, but are flexible and related to the social and political system. The point was not made just by these Frenchmen, but also by anthropologists, as I've said, and particularly among them Robert Lowy. He says, conceptual, spatial, temporal, and causal aspects of culture are not so many distinct realities. Insight into any one of them enhances our comprehension of the rest. Here, if anywhere, the functionalist point of view must be applied. That's really the theme of these lectures, that our concepts about space, time, causation are not distinct. They don't just float around up there. They are related to other parts of our social structure, political system, technology, economy. And it's difficult to really get that into our minds because we tend to think of our ideas as autonomous in a way. But this kind of interconnection is the fundamental idea which I had as I developed these lectures. And I really got it both through these general speculations and through a particular instance, which was the work of my DPhil examiner and great influence on my life, Edwardspritchard, the Oxford anthropologist, Edwardspritchard of the first half of the 20th century. One of the greatest of anthropologists to my mind. And in one of his greatest books, The Noah, he has a chapter on space and time, which I think is in many ways one of his great contributions to anthropology and has some links to Einstein. He tries to elaborate the ideas of space and time of this Sudanese pastoral people with whom he worked in the 1930s, the Nuer. He says, in describing Nuer concepts of time, we may distinguish between those that are mainly reflections of their relations to their environment, which we call ecological time, and those that are reflections of their relations to one another in the social structure, which we call structural time. Structural time appears to an individual passing through the social system to be entirely progressive. But as we shall see, this is in a sense an illusion. Ecological time appears to be and is cyclical. It's the rhythm of the seasons and the movement of this nomadic group. In some ways this is similar to what I've been saying in relation to Edmund Leach. He says time has not the same value throughout the year. When time is considered as relations between activities, it will be understood that it has a different connotation in the rains and the drought. And Edwardspritchard says the same thing in a very vivid metaphor, I think. The Noah do not have to coordinate their activities with an abstract passage of time, because their points of reference are the activities themselves. One does not make fishing dams because it's November. It is November, so one makes the fishing dams. In other words, you're making fishing dams. Well, it must be November. You don't think, look at your calendar and think it's time for making fishing dams. The same thing came out in the work of Frederick Barth when he's describing nomadic peoples in Persia, where he describes they come to a valley of mushrooms and they don't think, oh well, we better go and look at that valley because it's November and there'll be mushrooms there. They get to the valley and there are the mushrooms. It's the joke about rapid tourism, people whizzing around, say, Europe, and they get to the point where they say, we're in Rome, it must be Wednesday. We're in Madrid, it must be Friday. You know the days of the week from where you are. It's the same idea. This relates to the units of time and the measurement of time, which are usually not very precise in these situations. The normal units of time are the month, the day, the night. There are terms in these languages for today, tomorrow, yesterday. But there is no procession through time in ecological time. The daily timepiece is the cattle clock, as Edwardspritchard puts it. The rounds of pastoral tasks and the time of day and the passage of time through a day are to a Nuer primarily the succession of these tasks and the relations to one another. It is the activities themselves, chiefly of an economic kind, which are basic to the system and furnish most of its units and notations, and the passage of time is perceived in the relation of activities to one another. The implication of this idea, if you take it out of one particular tribal group to different ecologies, could be immense. Obviously, if this is true, then industrial time will be very different from agrarian time and from pastoral time. To continue with Edwardspritchard, though I have spoken of time and units of time, the Nuer have no expression equivalent to time. They don't have the concept of time in our language, and they cannot therefore, as we can, speak of time as though it was something actual, which passes, can be wasted, can be saved, and so forth. I do not think that they ever experience the same feeling of fighting against time, or of having to coordinate activities with an abstract passage of time, because their points of reference are mainly the activities themselves, which are generally of a leisurely character. Recently I was in China and talking to the young Chinese in the cities. There's a huge pressure on them. They seem to be fighting against time. They're always on the rush. They're caught in traffic jams. They've got more to do than they've got time to do. And even many of my colleagues are rushing from place to place. Famously put in Alice in Wonderland with the White Rabbit with his clock, looking at his clock, rushing the Duchess, and he's looking at his clock. I'm late for this, I'm late for that. We're always fighting with time, but the Nuer, whose traditionally their activities were quite leisurely, didn't have this idea. Events, he says, follow a logical order, but they are not controlled by an abstract system, there being no autonomous points of reference to which activities have to conform with precision. Nuer, he says, are fortunate. I think this is very illuminating, but Edwardspritchard then proceeds to show that time concepts are also influenced by space. The shallowness, the depth of time, how far back you think it goes, is related to what we know about the world. Now I think this is really what has a vast implication for understanding paradigmatic shifts and for the social sciences in general. Edwardspritchard writes on the shallowness of time, which is related to the shallowness of space among the Nuer. They only move around a very shallow area. It will have been noted that the Nuer time dimension is shallow. Time is not a continuum. The Nuer only think the world goes back a short way. Time is he says, a constant structural relationship between 2 points, the first and last person in a line of descent of relatives, of agnatic descent, that's descent through males. How shallow this is may be judged, he says, from the fact that the tree under which mankind came into being was still standing in western Nuerland a few years ago. Now, it's constantly amazing to us that for many centuries, and many people still believe this in some parts of the world, the Christian view was that the world came into being a few thousand years ago, very shallow, just some generations ago. The Nuer thought it came into being just, say, 7 or 10 or 15 generations ago, and the tree under which human beings were born is still there. You can go and see it. So their concept of time is very shallow, and their concept of space is very shallow. And I think the Christian concept of time being very, very shallow is related, as we'll see, to the concept of space. Beyond the annual cycle, this is me, time reckoning is a conceptualization of the social structure. Sorry, it isn't me, it's Edwardspritchard. And the points of reference are a projection into the past of actual relations between groups of persons. It is less a means of coordinating events than of coordinating relationships, and is therefore mainly a looking backwards, since relationships must be explained in terms of the past. This is very, very central. We use time, or our sense of history and how we've got to where we are, to explain, confirm and understand how things are in the present. This is the function of myth and, to a certain extent, history. For instance, if you are an international politician and you want to create tension between societies, you rewrite the recent past to bring out all the threats and unpleasantness in the relationship. If you want to make up and be friends, you then bring out all the good things and all the good times you had together with this other nation. So you adjust history to fit in with your present desires in terms of relationships. That works at the international level as well as the level of newer kinship groups. Thus, and this is me, thus it's not merely a matter of time and space being related in the way that Einstein pointed out. It's not just geographical space, but crucially social and political space, which determine our notions of time. This is explained again by Edwardspritchard. The shallow depth of structural time, I quote, "Moreover, since time is to the knower an order of events of outstanding significance to a group, each group has its own points of reference, and time is consequently relative to structural space, locally considered. In course of time, the names of years are forgotten, and all events beyond the limits of this crude historical reckoning fade into the dim vista of long, long ago. Historical time, in the sense of a sequence of outstanding events of significance to a tribe, goes back much further than the historical time of smaller groups. But 50 years is probably the limit, and I've seen this, for instance, in Cambridge in relation to my life in Cambridge. We remember certain ancestors, we remember certain events, and things get dropped off. You stop talking in your lectures about certain theories, about certain people, and you move on and you rewrite the history of your discipline, or the history of your college, or the history of your organization, or the history of your family, if you're in a family, as you move through it. So time is relative to social relations. It's relative to kinship relations. I again quote, "Time perspective is here not a true impression of actual distances, like that created by our dating techniques, but a reflection of relations between lineages, so that the traditional events recorded have to be placed at the points where the lineages concerned in them converge in their lines of ascent as you go back. So you put the events at crucial points in the lineage structure. Time is thus not a continuum, but a constant structural relationship between 2 points. The first point, the first ancestor, and the last people in this ancestral line." The implications of this idea more widely is that time is not determined mainly by ecology, by the natural world, or even by technology, or even by the relations of production, as Marx would say, but by political and social relationships more generally. As Edwardspritchard put it in talking of structural time, there is, however, a point at which we can say that time concepts cease to be determined by ecological factors and become more determined by structural interrelations, being no longer a reflection of man's dependence on nature, but a reflection of the interaction of social groups. Edwardspritchard then develops a similar scheme for space. There are two types of space. Ecological distance, in this sense, is a relation, he says, between communities defined in terms of density and distribution, and with reference to water, vegetation, animal and insect life, and so on. Structural distance is of a very different order. By structural distance is meant the distance between groups of persons in a social system, expressed in terms of values. Now this, I think, is a great insight and can be extended to the whole set of theories I'm considering. Concepts of time and space are closely interrelated, and hence at a wider level, the disciplines of anthropology and sociology and of archaeology and history are very closely related to each other at a much deeper level. Time thus becomes an aspect of the social structure, and history becomes very closely related to what anthropologists call myth, which is not that it's untrue, but it is something that can be shifted and changed. Thus, what anthropology says of myth applies to time and to history. Myths are often interpreted by anthropologists as charters, as ways of describing why things must be as they are. Fortes, for example, says their myths and legends are one means of rationalizing and defining the structural relationship of group to group, or the pattern of their institutions, and history and the underpinning of the social sciences are myths in that sense. So to conclude this rather long lecture, but I hope you can see that it's really fundamental to rethink our categories and to see how much they are not absolutely embedded, but shaped by much wider forces. To conclude, we know that there are paradigmatic shifts of the kind that Kuhn, Foucault, Kroeber and others have mentioned, and that we are imprisoned in them. We can't see them when we live in them. We can see them in the past, and they will change in the future, as Adam Smith long ago noticed. Secondly, we can conclude that the history of all the social sciences are most broadly interpreted. Give an example of several of these, particularly in relation to the ideas of progress, of time, of evolution, of change. These are our cosmologies. We erect our social theories to explain our worlds, and they go right across disciplines. And finally, it would appear that anthropological work in the very simplest societies suggests that shifts from one paradigm to another are related to technology, to things like writing, money, agricultural technology changing to industrial technology. That's an important theme. But even more, they're related to our social relationships, how we think of other people, and to power relationships, the power relationship between groups. And in these lectures, what I will be doing is applying that to the whole cosmology, as I call it, of capitalism over the last 500 years, and seeing that as the power relationships between different parts of the world shift, so that one becomes dominant and one declines, so our concepts of time change. The basic idea is that if there is a huge disparity, so that one nation, one part of the world is miles ahead, then we tend to think of time as whizzing up to us. if we're ahead, and then back there. On the other hand, if it's fairly level, we tend to think of time as fairly static. There isn't much progress. And I think that is probably more important even than the fact that if technologies are shifting very fast, we can think of time moving up because we see primitive technologies, better technologies, and hopefully even better ones, as Bacon did. So we'll come to that in the lectures ahead.